Good morning. I'm Lenora Bresler. Welcome to the April 12th, 2017 edition of the Bible Delight in the Details as we prepare ourselves for Easter, talking about the Passover Seder with which Jesus prepared himself and his disciples for the events of the Passion Weekend. Now, yesterday we were talking about the fact that the Passover Seder, which means order, is really around four cups of wine. The other thing that you have to understand about this is that it is centered around the asking of questions by the youngest member of the party. In the case of the Last Supper, we know that church tradition indicates that was the disciple John, and indeed the Gospels indicate that it was John who was reclining against the bosom of Christ. We talked in an earlier session about that means he was in the proper place to be the youngest, so he would have been asking questions. Why do we do this and that and that? There were symbolic things on the table that would have been in the midst of much other kind of food. Jerusalem cuisine, by the way, was known for being, it was kind of the French cuisine of the Middle East of that day, highly revered. The spices that were available in Jerusalem were very great. The salt, the pepper, and many more, what we would consider today exotic spices, really made the cuisine excellent in Jerusalem. So there would have been a huge feast, and the symbolic foods that would have been eaten as well would have been a part of a much larger feast. So you need to understand that. The feast actually lasted 4 or 5 hours and went through a series of questions that the youngest member of the group would ask, and then the father or leader of the group, Jesus, of course, in the case of the Last Supper, would have explained. And it walked them through the entire beginning of the Bible, starting in Genesis with Abraham, going through the enslavement after Joseph's great reign in Egypt, and then, of course, the whole saving of them through the coming of Moses and God intervening with the plagues and all of that. Ending, of course, with Passover, the original Passover night, where the angel of death went through Egypt and killed the firstborn of every Egyptian family and livestock. And the Israelites were only protected because they had slaughtered an innocent lamb and dipped the blood, and dipped something in the blood, hyssop plant, and then painted the door. Interestingly, painting horizontally and vertically, which reminds us, of course, ultimately of the cross, to which all of this points. Now, I want you to imagine that Last Supper, and Christ has been asked, as is appropriate, as is expected by John, the questions of, why do we do this? Why do we eat that? And Jesus Christ himself is explaining it all. Can you imagine what that must have been like? The master teacher of all teachers, the greatest teacher that has ever walked the earth, is telling them what they are supposed to get out of, what they are supposed to understand about a ritual, a festival that he himself created, talking about a real life event that he himself coordinated. I tell you, what would you give short of your very salvation to be at that lesson, at that Sunday school lesson, which was held, of course, on a Thursday night, or at least that's when we celebrate it. That's when we memorialize it. So it's absolutely fascinating that this is, when you think about what was going on. Now, I told you last time that I was going to talk to you today about that second cup. The second cup is the cup of judgment or wrath. And in the story, as the leader is explaining the story, this is where some symbolic things are done at the same time that he's teaching the lesson. And it comes at the part of the story about the bondage, about the terrible, terrible suffering of the Israelites for 400 years as slaves. Now, on the table would be salt water, and we would put parsley or watercress. And as the leader is explaining about the horrible things that happened to the Israelites, they would be dipping the parsley into the salt water and eating it. And this reminded them of the bitter tears that they shed in Egypt. There would also be something called haricot, which I make actually. It is a sweet kind of a dish. It's made out of apples, chunks of apples, a lot of cinnamon. You kind of make a paste of it, and it looks brownish, reddish brown. And that is to remind you visually of the mortar of the bricks that the Israelites were forced to make and then to build. Now, interestingly, although it looks like bricks, which were a sign of affliction and slavery, it's very sweet. It tastes very good. And so that's a reminder that even in the midst of the affliction, there was the sweetness that God had not forgotten and would deliver, and did indeed deliver them. Now, when it came specifically to the recitation about the plagues, the 10 plagues that God rained down, sometimes literally, on Egypt, what would be done is they would drink the cup, but only after there had been the full recitation of the wrath that was poured out upon the Egyptians for their misdeeds in enslaving and treating so harshly the Israelites. Now, as each of the plagues was discussed, it became tradition for the Jews to dip their finger into the wine glass and then flick a little bit of that, a little drop, onto the plate. And this was to show empathy and remember the suffering of those Egyptians. Because even if you are being judged for your sin, we all sin, and we should all be sorry when the wrath of God is poured out on other people. And we should do everything in our power to help them prevent that and get them right with God. The New Testament says, Paul tells us we are to be reconcilers, mediators between God and man. We are to help reconcile that situation. And so we show great empathy. We're not judgmental. We're not happy when someone goes down because of their sin. We're sorry, and we wish that it could have been prevented. And we do everything we can in an appropriate way to help counsel and possibly intervene. After the flicking of the 10 drops, then the cup is drunk. And it's a reminder to us all. We always like to think we're on the right side and that it's somebody else that needs to drink that cup of wrath, but it's us too. And it's only because the Passover lamb, in the case of the literal saving of the Israelites in Egypt, and of course later in the spiritual context of Christ, the Passover lamb's blood, that we are saved and freed from that cup of judgment. Once again, remember, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ prayed to his Father, saying, Father, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. He is most likely referring to the cup of judgment, which would be poured out in full measure as he became sin for us on the cross. I'm Lenora Bresler. Visit me tomorrow as we talk about exactly how Christ instituted communion. Trust me, you will never view communion quite the same again. I hope you're having a blessed Holy Week. Have a marvelous day.